We're trying something a little bit new tonight, something we're calling Artifactoids, which is essentially what we hope will be an interesting show and tell. Museum board members and other history interested folks were invited to pick an artifact in the region of Three Oaks Museum's collection and do a 5 to 10 minute illustrated talk on that item. So you're going to hear 5 such presentations tonight. And I'd like to thank the folks who labored long and hard putting these together. They really did yeoman's work on this, and you'll hear the results of their labors in a minute. A few quick notes again for anybody who's joining us late. Do mute yourself if you could. At the end of each talk, the speakers are going to, you can ask questions, and you can unmute yourself to ask those questions, or you can type them in the chat room. Either way will work. And I will just say that we're less than a week away now. No, we're 9 days away, sorry, from the museum opening for the season. May 1st is the first day of regular visitation. There is a members preview the night before. And one of the new exhibits that we have on tap this year is an exhibit on dentistry. And that exhibit would not have been possible without the efforts of our first presenter, Dave Mania. And I'll let Dave take the floor now. Dave, it's all yours. I'm going to.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Hello and good evening to everyone. I'd like to take just a few moments of your time to speak to you about the field of dentistry and the exhibit that recently moved from our dental office in Three Oaks in the basement and placed on display at the Three Oaks Museum. As you can see right next to me is a dental drill, and we're going to talk about that as we go through the presentation. And I'm going to explain to you one of the areas in which we have seen a change in that part of dentistry. Now, dentistry has evolved over the centuries to a state-of-the-art science that it is today. The first milestone in relationship to dentistry occurred about 3000 BC. There was a gentleman by the name of Hesse Ray, and he was an Egyptian, and he was thought to have been the first dentist. The next milestone we're all familiar with, and that was George Washington. Remember, he said he could not tell a lie. A lot of people thought that he had a mouthful of wooden teeth, but actually he only had one tooth in his head. The remainder were made of ivory or tusks or other such materials, such as human teeth belonging to someone else. The next photo we're going to show you is year 1895 to 1896, and that's when Röntgen invented the X-ray and received a Nobel Prize for his discovery. Now, why is this significant? Well, it was right around this time when the first dentist came to Three Oaks, Dr. Frank Hinchman. Not much is really known about Dr. Hinchman, except that he was a member of the Oddfellows Club. And the next milestone was the advent of stannous fluoride. Now, I'm sure that because of your ages, we're going to show you a video that might bring back some memories.
Gee, I almost got a bullseye. Let's see if it's that. What's this? Oh, I never could beat Anne. Then we were on opposite sides in a toothpaste test. My side used Crest. Anne's side used the same toothpaste, but without fluorescein. And that's when I beat Anne, because my side had 21% fewer cavities with Crest.
In similar tests, Crest reduced cavities 34% and 42%. You know, more dentists recommend Crest than all other toothpastes combined. So have regular checkups, watch treats, and brush after eating with Crest. Accepted by the Council on Dental Therapeutics of the American Dental Association, as signified by this statement and this seal.
Nice shooting, Anne.
Remember, the only toothpaste with over 12 years of tests that prove it reduces cavities is Crest.
Now, let's take a look back at the evolution of dentistry right here in Three Oaks. Shortly after Dr. Hinchman, who was involved with our community in Three Oaks, there came Dr. McKenzie, Dr. T.F. McKenzie, approximately 1901, who picked up where his predecessor left off and continued to move the science forward. Dr. McKenzie practiced for some 35 years. His office is located on the corner of Elm and Linden, actually 103 South Elm. This is a small building of about 450 square feet, all brick, but since then there has been an addition put on to what was the state-of-the-art facility. And it still stands in the same location. The building was designed by the Ritter Company in 1935 because Dr. McKenzie purchased all of his new equipment from the same company. And so as a courtesy, they designed his building for him. An article in a local newspaper cited the building as having the most modern heating system of its time. It used fuel oil and not coal, as that seemed to be the predominant fuel. As time went on, there was again another evolution in the area of dental sciences when Dr. Lester Knight, the son-in-law of Dr. McKenzie, took over as a dental practitioner in Three Oaks. This continued on until 1980 when Dr. Lester Knight retired and Dr. Deborah Mania became the practitioner in Three Oaks until the current date. Now, Dr. Mania, my wife, is now joined by our son, Dr. Paul Mania, who is transitioning over as the new dentist for the area. So as you can see, there is kind of a connection between Dr. Hinchman, the old handpiece, Drs. Paul and Deborah Mania, and kind of the new technology that we're shortly going to talk about. Also, in the evolution of dentistry, there has been a significant change in the equipment that has been used. As an example of this technology, I'd like to focus on that one piece of equipment that I showed you earlier, the dental handpiece, sometimes referred to as the terrible dental handpiece. But it has changed over the last 50 years, evolving into an almost painless tool for healing. Now, the first piece of equipment we're going to take a look at is what we called the spinning jenny. And the spinning jenny was used in dental restoration, but it had a problem. It only revolved the drill bit about 100 to 125 RPMs. Now, this equipment was foot pedal operated, a lot like a sewing machine, and resulted in a lot of discomfort to the patient. Remember, the slower the RPMs, the higher the pain factor. Now, the next piece of equipment was the slow speed handpiece and the first electric drill, which came into play about the late 1870s or the early 1900s. It had an RPM of about 800 to 900 RPMs. Later, there was another development, and now the handpiece operated at 1500 RPMs, getting much faster. Next came the advent of the high-speed air and electric turbines, and they rotated at about 5,500 to 6,000 RPMs. Now, how do we achieve such high speeds and torque? The best way to look at this is to look at a jet engine. A jet engine has fins on it that are mounted on a shaft. Fuel and air are put into the chamber and burned, and out of the rear of the engine comes a high-speed air, which thrusts the engine forward. Now, this is very similar to the way the dental turbine worked. High-pressure air enters the handpiece and spins the turbine to create the speed and the torque that is needed to cut dental enamel. Now, some of the modern versions of the air-driven handpiece will rotate at about 300,000 RPMs. Now, that's quite a bit different than the 100 RPMs that the spinning jenny operated at. Now, today, there's a new adventure out there. It's called the dental laser handpiece. It is the state of the art for dental restoration. Not many practices have this piece of equipment because the cost is so prohibitive, about $135,000. The laser does not require air or water, and in many cases, anesthesia is not necessary for the patient. It directly destroys the dental decay in the tooth by way of heat and vaporization somewhat painlessly. Now, there is actually two lasers on the market today. One is a soft tissue laser to cut gingiva or the gum, and the other is a hard tissue laser which cuts enamel or bone. So now you can kind of see the way technology has evolved, just as the science itself has evolved. So in conclusion, today, as well as centuries ago, we have seen an evolution in the field of dentistry in our community and the equipment used. From the time of the Babylonians to the Egyptians until today, we have seen a change and an improvement in the science that has benefited mankind. Thank you.
All right.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, take questions, and either, again, you can either unmute yourself and ask those questions or write them out in the chat room. I had one quick question, Dave, about what's the cost curve on those laser drills? Is that something that's likely to be at a dentist near you in 2 years or 10 years, or do you have a feel for that?
Well, I would say the way technology turns itself over, I would say probably in the next 10 years, it's going to be a lot like the computers. Remember, computers were $4,000 and $5,000. Now you can buy them for, little or nothing. It's the same way it's going to happen. Technology, competition, it's going to drive the price down. It will, I'm sure.
I'm going to go to the second presentation. Forgive me, I have to do a little button clicking here on my own to get to Judy's presentation. The second presenter is in fact the collections manager at the museum, Judy Jackson, and she's got an artifact with a somewhat personal connection. So I'll turn it over to you, Judy.
It's a very personal connection, you're right. And it does have one thing in common with Dave Mania and his wife. It's a tooth, a very large tooth. And in 1983, while digging a trench with a trenching machine, my father, Eugene Gridley, discovered something very interesting. Upon looking at what he thought was a big rock that was kicked up by the machine, he realized that actually it was a prehistoric tooth from a very large animal. Pictured here is my father in the office of the Green River Gazette in Three Oaks. Jim Bowner, owner of the Gazette, thought the tooth was very interesting and worthy of a photo in our local paper that week. 2 years ago, unfortunately, my mother passed away at the age of 98, and my sister and I felt that the best home for the tooth that my father had found was the Region of Three Oaks Museum, where we thought many other people could enjoy it as well as our family had for many years. For almost 40 years, we thought we had a woolly mammoth tooth. And until recently, we found out through the help of Michigan State University museum staff that actually my father had found a mastodon tooth, not a woolly mammoth. Both large animals lived in our area here in southwestern Michigan between 10 and 15,000 years ago. Benjamin Franklin was one of the first to study the mammoth and the mastodon fossils that had been found. Franklin discovered that mastodons and mammoths' teeth and tusks were very different from each other. You can see by these teeth being held that they're very different. They're both molars. You can see the tooth on the left is from a mastodon and is very pointed, while the tooth on the right is a woolly mammoth and is extremely flat. The woolly mammoth ate green grass and leaves with his flat teeth, while the mastodon ate shrubs and small branches and sticks with its pointed teeth. Scientists called the mastodon's teeth nipple teeth because they were so pointed. Again, in the picture, you'll notice the sharp teeth of the mastodon, and on the left, compare it with the flat tooth of the woolly mammoth. The mammoth has large curled tusks, while you can see in this picture on the left how curved they are. The mastodon's tusks were smaller and straighter than the mammoth. The mastodon was more like the elephant that we know today, where the woolly mammoth was like an elephant, but much, much larger. Skulls also had noticeable differences. The mammoth was the larger animal and had a pointed skull, which you'll see on the left photo with the arrow. The mastodon's skull was smaller and had a more flat or rounded top. Well-preserved tusks in their entirety do not exist because the enamel was much thinner on the tusks than it was on the teeth of the animal. The photo on the screen now is a picture of the most complete mammoth ever found in Michigan. Most discoveries of fossils of these animals are found in the lower half of the lower peninsula of Michigan, south of the Grand Rapids area. The skeleton in this picture was found on a farm in Eau Claire, Michigan, which is about 30 miles from Three Oaks. The picture shows the skeleton of a woolly mammoth on display at Andrews University in Berrien Springs, where the skeleton was donated. This skeleton is one of the most intact to ever be found, but you'll notice that the tusks are not real, but man-made. In 1900, two workers on the Warren farm south of the village of Three Oaks were digging post holes when they found two molars of a woolly mammoth. Those two teeth were donated to the Chamberlain Memorial Museum, excuse me, and later became part of the Michigan State University Museum collection. Not only did my father find a mastodon tooth on West Harbor Road, but records show that a Mrs. Frankfurt also found a mastodon tooth, possibly in the same area of West Harbor Road. Her tooth was found in 1925. That tooth was also donated to the Chamberlain Warren Museum and later sent on to Michigan State University. A few of the other area fossils that have been found in our area that you might recognize are Eau Claire. 6 teeth were found in 1896. The Avery Marsh east of Three Oaks, Bakertown Marsh near Buchanan, a discovery was made in 1920. Watervliet, Baroda, Hager Township north of Benton Harbor, and the 2 teeth that have been found on West Harbor Road, Mrs. Frankfurt's and my father's. I would like you to also know that in 2002, the mastodon was made the official fossil of the state of Michigan. I'd like to invite everyone to come to the Region of Three Oaks Museum and see our mastodon tooth. You'll see we have a very good example. It was an older animal. The tooth is not pointed anymore. It's very worn, but the roots are in very good condition and still intact. You can see how large the tooth is by the size of my hand. This tooth is on exhibit, and we invite you to come and take a look.
All right. Thank you, Judy. If there are any questions, we can entertain those. Dave, you can't have it to experiment with drills. I would say that. All right. Well, I'm going to move on to the third artifact then. I actually have the artifact in my hand, which is it was a somewhat mysterious artifact. It was a yellowed newspaper article. We were in the back of the museum in Three Oaks, and we ran across this. It had the arresting headline that you perhaps can see: "Love Nest Broken Up by Officers." Well, you have to read on there. And it told a scandalous story of a Three Oaks public official who took money that wasn't his and then ran off with a wife that wasn't his also. So we checked with longtime Three Oaks residents, and nobody knew anything much about it. And since the man had an unusual name, we were able to track down the article to a Wisconsin newspaper. We still found nothing in the article, but that one article about Richard Jorpama. So we turned to Suzanne Levy, who's a super history sleuth and a research librarian by trade, to do some digging. And she uncovered the whole amazing story. And Suzanne, I'm going to let you then take it from here.
Okay, thanks, Nick. When Nick asked me for a little help on finding more about this article, he knew I had a subscription, I think, to newspapers.com. So the first thing I did was go to newspapers.com, and I found the article in the Sheboygan Press. So I did a search in newspapers.com for the name Richard Jorpama or Jorpama, however we don't know, it's not the right name, so who knows how it was pronounced. Anyway, after that search, I got a couple of hits, which are the next slide. From the Sheboygan Press, August 3rd, 1926. There's our name, Richard Jorpama. And on the next slide, I believe you'll see the headline, the full page article there. The sub headline, "Alleged Embezzler Caught at Falls, Love Nest Broken Up." And that's the article that you have in the museum. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the article in a minute, but I want to set it in place here. So I began to search for more articles on Richard Jorpama. There's nothing else under that name in newspapers.com. This is a picture of Sheboygan in that time period, the 1920s. It's a city on Lake Michigan, just a little more than halfway between Milwaukee and Green Bay. So it was a fairly prosperous town, and we'll tell more about how they got there. So my next source was the Fulton, New York Postcard Forum, where they have indexed all of the Three Oaks newspapers. So I looked for Richard Jorpama here and came up with absolutely nothing. Then I tried Ancestry.com, which is a genealogy and local history database. Nothing was there either. So I had to rethink the process. How was I going to find more about this Richard Jorpama person? Because I couldn't believe local papers hadn't picked anything up. So having done this once before and knowing it was somebody with ties to Three Oaks, I decided to search Ancestry.com for the 1920 census. And I looked for anybody with the first name Richard. And 4 Richards came up in Three Oaks in 1920. And at the top of the list was Richard Jortsma, as you see here, spelled Jorittsma, and Richard with a T. He's living there with his wife, Grace, his daughter, and his mother-in-law and brother-in-law. And they're living in town, and there he was. So I had a new name to search for. I also checked him out in the 1910 census. I should say in 1910, he was living in Bertrand Township, and he is listed as a butter maker in a butter factory. Further articles in the paper, or note the spelling differences. Here it appears it's 2 R's in 1910 and 1 R in 1920. And this is very typical on census records, that you find multiple spellings of names. But basically this is the same man, the same family, even though his wife is Maggie in one and Grace in the other. I began searching all 3 databases then. Now that I had a better name than Jorpama, I started searching them for both spellings of Joritsma, with 1 R and with 2. And I found out he'd married Grace DeBoer in Three Oaks. He was a dairyman or a creamery operator, and he seemed to move back and forth between Three Oaks and Buchanan. This is the Three Oaks Dairy, which I think there'd been some question about in recent years. I believe this is at the site of the vet's office in Three Oaks now, but this was the Three Oaks Dairy, probably in the 19-teens sometime. And our Richard was the, he ran the creamery there. He was the creamery operator. Later on, in around 1920, he went into business with Raymond Hoffman, who was a son-in-law of C.K. Warren, and they ran a cash and carry grocery store in the early 1920s. I know from articles that they bought that property from George Gross, but I'm not sure where it was. Anyway, things were quiet, and in about 1924, our friend Richard Joritsma was elected township treasurer. And note that the supervisor at the time was George F. Carrier. He was elected township supervisor. And things were quiet until in June of 1926, a warrant was issued for Richard Joritsma's arrest, saying he had disappeared on June 1st. A Mrs. Jenny Long of the village was also missing. And later on June 12th, the South Bend Tribune announced he was missing. Those articles basically said Joritsma, owner of a creamery and a grocery store in Three Oaks and one of the community's most respected men, was treasurer of the township last year. Although he was an extremely hardworking man, he was not considered a good businessman. His affairs became so entangled that eventually he owed $15,000. Last year, Mr. Carrier, the supervisor, made a mistake in levying the township taxes. Instead of spreading the customary 1 mil tax for roads, he spread 2 1 mil taxes. Joritsma, as treasurer, dutifully collected the taxes. When it became apparent that the citizens had been double taxed, Mr. Carrier, who was despondent because of his wife's critical illness and his defeat in the election by John Hoven in 1926, was overcome by the hint of scandal and committed suicide. His wife died soon afterwards on May 10th. The township board made every effort to get the money back without exposing Joritsma, who was felt to be a victim of circumstances rather than a crook. He made arrangements to obtain the necessary money from C.K. Warren and gave Mr. Warren a chattel mortgage on his property. Mr. Warren was to pay the township according to officials. At some point, with a new administration, he became afraid and decided to leave town. And that's where we come up with the article in the Sheboygan. Well, he left town and was gone for most of the summer. Nobody knew where he was in June and July. But on August 3rd, that article ran in the newspaper, in the Sheboygan newspaper. And a very similar article ran the next day in the St. Joe paper. And I'm reading from the St. Joe paper, which has a little bit more details. Mr. George, the sheriff started looking for him, and he started looking in towns that had very big dairying concerns, knowing that Mr. Jortsma was a dairyman. And at some point he went to Sheboygan because of its being a dairy center. And he met with the sheriff was Sheriff Franz from Berrien County, and he met Sheriff Franz met with the sheriff in Wisconsin, and they started doing some sleuthing, and they came across a car with Michigan license plates in Sheboygan Falls. They went to the door, and there's a landlady there who told them that, yes, a nice couple was living there, and Mr. Jortsma was home. They placed him under arrest. The landlady thought that the couple was married, which wasn't the case. And well, Jortsma had been working in a factory. Mrs. Long was working in a pea cannery at the time. She was at work, and they found her there. Essentially, they brought them back to Three Oaks, where Jortsma was arraigned and charged with embezzlement. He was sent to the county jail, where he failed to make bail. Mrs. Long was freed to the custody of her husband, although the next day her husband took her up to St. Joe to the jail, where she visited with Jortsma while her husband stayed in the car. It's quite a story. Three Oaks citizens, including his son-in-law, helped get him released from jail. The bond was reduced from $5,000 to $2,000. Local citizens supported him strongly and expressed confidence that all would be repaid. He was back in Three Oaks. This is a photo of Three Oaks, Elm Street in that time period in the 1920s. You see Dryer's Market there in the middle of the block. So we're on the west side of Elm Street. You see the library across the tracks in the background. This is kind of what the village was looking like at that time period. In 1928, there was a suit filed by a John Jacobson of Chicago. Jacobson, it appears, owned several of the dairying concerns, or he had a milk concern, and he had loaned our friend Richard the money to pay some of his debts, and he was suing to get his money back. As you can see, Jortsma was, in April of 28, Jortsma was ordered to pay Mr. Jacobson back. At that point, he moved on to Indiana, where he worked in both South Bend and Indianapolis. But by 1930, according to the census, he was back in Michigan, living in the Buchanan-Niles area, where he remained through 1940. Newspaper articles show Jortsma and his wife coming, interacting with people in town. They belonged to the Reformed Church. Both couples reunited, I should say. And the Jortsmas moved to Tampa, Florida around 1951 and are buried there. And as you can see from their tombstone, they died with the double R spelling. So I found probably more records with two R's in his name than in one R. His draft registration in the 1940s had the two R's. But he and his wife reunited, and they're buried in Tampa, Florida. Mrs. Jenny Long, who returned to her husband Lewis, remained in Three Oaks for the rest of their lives. And as an aside, I came across this the other day. When my grandmother Sheldon died, Jenny Long was one of the visitors to the funeral home, and I have the guest book from the funeral home, and Mrs. Jenny Long was there at the wake for my grandmother. I have no recollection of her but I thought that was kind of an interesting fact about Three Oaks. If you want to read more about these people, the Three Oaks papers follow their life stories, as do area papers, which you can find on newspapers.com and ancestry.com. And this last slide shows links to the resources that I used. That last one, I did a basic Google source, and our friend Richard was working at a dairy in Cassopolis, and they were selling, he and 5 other men were selling butter that didn't have 80% butterfat content out of state, and they were fined $50 by the FDA. So it's always good to do a basic Google search when you're looking for a particular name. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me or get in touch with me, and I'll be glad to share some of the articles with you. I think Nick's going to have many of them at the museum.
Yeah. Well, that the FDA scandal is slightly less intriguing than the initial scandal. But
That's true.
It was amazing to me how quickly Suzanne tracked down the real spelling. And of course, once that happened, there was just an avalanche of information about this rather florid case. So if there are questions, again, you can either put them in the chat. There's a comment that says really interesting, Suzanne. But,
oh, thank you. I had a lot of fun doing this, and, I'm happy to be on call for research.
Good.
That's what I like to do.
We'll take you up on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. All right, let me go on to our 4th presenter now. It's the museum's expert on all things Civil War and a museum board member himself, Randy Miller, has an item, an artifact from the Civil War collection at the museum. So Randy, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I hope you can hear me. This is a Civil War cartridge case. It was used for holding pistol and rifle cartridges used by soldiers on both sides of the conflict. Ammunition back then was really different from what armies use today. It was a lengthy process just to load a gun. The image on the left shows a bundle of cartridges wrapped in paper. It appears to hold about 4 or 5 in the bundle. The image on the right shows how the packets are separated. According to the Ordnance Manual of 1849, the wrapping paper in which they were kept was waterproofed by immersing it in a molten mix of beeswax, linseed oil, and spirits of turpentine. The bullet was encapsulated in one end of the package, while the gunpowder charge was in the other. Here's a video which shows the loading process.
Order, arms.
No position was as important as load in 9 times. The loading drill taught not only the steps in loading the musket, but for the officers established a standard rate of fire for his men and his company. The drill would begin with the order.
Load in 9 times, load.
The musket brought to the center of the feet in a snug but convenient
Handle.
location
Cartridge.
to handle the rammer and to place eyes on the muzzle. And to his cartridge box, which held the 40 hand-rolled paper rounds. With a cartridge between the thumb and pointer finger, place the cartridge to the mouth, using teeth to open the powder end of the cartridge, bullet to the front of the muzzle. Dumping the gunpowder down the barrel, then squeezing the bullet into the muzzle.
Draw rammer.
Placing the tulip or head of the rammer upon the point of the bullet.
Ram cartridge. Return rammer.
In battle, many nervous soldiers would forget this and would shoot their rammers at the rebels.
High.
The musket is now eased in front of the soldier. muzzle down range at the height of the eye.
Shoulder, arms.
In battle, every man was supposed to finish the loading process in 15 to 20 seconds. By the book, every man could shoot 3 rounds per minute. Each company of 90 muskets could fire 270 rounds per minute. Every regiment of 10 companies could fire 2,700 rounds per minute. By the Middle War period, the average strength of a regiment in the Army of the Potomac was 400 men. Firing 3 rounds per minute, a veteran regiment could easily expend 12,000 rounds in a 10-minute firefight. At the Battle of Gettysburg, the high tide of the war, Mr. Lincoln's Army of the Potomac had grown into a perfect killing machine.
This particular case is unique in that we know which soldier carried it. We know that because his name is engraved on it. This case belonged to Three Oaks area resident Oliver W. Brockway. Oliver Brockway served in the 12th Michigan Infantry, Company A. The 12th Michigan participated in some very bloody battles during the war, with the most deadly being the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862. The 12th distinguished itself during that fight by being part of an advanced guard that held up the entire Confederate Army long enough for the rest of the Union forces to regroup and eventually win the day. The story goes that General Grant, who had earlier been relieved of command and reinstated just before the Battle of Shiloh, would have likely been drummed out of the military had the Union Army lost that battle. Brockway himself was not involved in that campaign because he did not join until February of 1864. He spent much of his time in and around Duval's Bluff, which was a major supply depot for the war effort. Much of what we know about Oliver Brockway comes from his 1919 obituary in the Acorn, which was the Three Oaks newspaper at that time. Brockway was born in 1833 in Ohio. He moved to Three Oaks around 1855 after having spent time in Michigan City, Indiana, doing construction work for the new railroad freight depot being constructed there. Brockway returned to Ohio during that time and married his wife, Mary. Their marriage would last over 60 years and produce 5 sons. When the Brockways returned from Ohio, they settled down in the small community of Avery, just east of Three Oaks. Oliver Brockway went to work at the nearby Love and Avery sawmill. The Love and Avery mill was one of the largest mills in the area. That sawmill had what was called a muley saw. A muley saw was driven by either steam or water, and the blade moved up and down because circular saws were unknown at that time. Brockway would later recount the enormous logs they encountered while working there. He claimed to have seen one log that was so large that it broke the sled on which they tried to haul it. At the mill, it was too large to get beneath the saw and first had to be hewed. According to Brockway, this tree was 60 feet tall to the first limb. Unfortunately, his work at the mill would be short-lived because one evening while he and Mrs. Brockway were making a social call in Three Oaks, the Love and Avery sawmill burned to the ground. After that, Oliver Brockway became a prominent farmer on his land in Avery. The image of Oliver Brockway that we've used throughout this presentation came from a period photograph of several prominent Three Oaks residents who posed together in celebration of the grand opening of E.K. Warren's new office building in 1905. That building would later become the Chamberlain Museum and ultimately the Three Oaks Library. Mr. Brockway and E.K. Warren had been friends for years. One of the last trips Mr. Warren made while in Three Oaks was to call upon Mr. Brockway. Oliver Brockway passed away in 1919 at the age of 86, just a few months after E.K. Warren. As for his wife, Mary Brockway, she went to live with her son in Iowa after Oliver had died. She passed away in 1924 at the age of 88. Oliver and Mary Brockway are buried in Forest Lawn Cemetery in Three Oaks Township.
Yeah, was he, did Oliver die in the flu epidemic?
He had actually broke his leg a year earlier and he never fully recovered.
Okay,
And he went to sleep one afternoon and he never woke up.
okay.
Reasonable question, though, given Three Oaks' rather, terrible
Right.
brush with that epidemic. Right. All right. Great. Thank you, Randy. So this is the fireman's hat. And again, this will be in the 1870s era. And this is what passed for a helmet back in those days. It's fabric, and it may have been somewhat waxed. It appears to be a little bit shiny. I'm not sure how well you can see it. It does have the word Tempest written on the back, as does the fireman's belt here. Tempest. So the story I'm going to tell is about the Tempest Fire Company. And so, as I said, this was Three Oaks' first formal volunteer firefighting force. The company was formed on May 5th of 1875. Charles Close was at that point its foreman. The photo above shows, the photo here shows 18 volunteers. The Tempest Company also had a horse-drawn hose cart and pumper wagon, a low wagon upon which was mounted a long-handled, manually operated pump. Now, the artifacts I showed you were said to belong to a firefighter named Herman Gellow, or Gelo, G-E-L-O-W. They were part of the Chamberlain Warren Museum collection that went to Michigan State Museum in the 1950s. So Michigan State is lending them to us to display this year, and they'll be part of this new exhibit called Fire, which will open, as I said, along with the museum on May 1st. So the Tempest Company may have been formed in 1875, but it was massive fires 4 years earlier that led to its formation. This is a painting by a River Valley High School senior, Brianna Martin, done at our request, at our commission, that shows what October of 1871 was like in this area as wildfires raged and threatened homes. Dr. Greenemeyer of Three Oaks recalled forest fires broke out all around us, extending from our town to Lake Michigan, New Buffalo, and including the Avery Marsh. Other accounts said a wide swath of land from Sawyer to New Troy also burned, and severe drought and high winds made the area tinderbox. And as this 1937 newspaper retrospective noted, the whole south end of the county was covered with brush. People had been clearing the land, keep in mind, for many decades, about 30 years or so. And so the whole south end of the county was covered with brush and the logged over tracks, and it was dry as tinder. The result was this Berrien County record headline: fire, fire, fire everywhere. Michigan cities, towns, and villages destroyed. Great suffering. It was that way over most of Michigan. The cities of Holland and Port Huron burned to the ground. Their downtown areas did. Across the lake, of course, much of Chicago also burned. About 300 people died in that great Chicago fire, and 100,000 people were left homeless. Overwhelmed Chicago firefighters put out a call for help, and in response, New Buffalo sent a pumper truck by barge. That truck was later displayed for years outside the fire station in New Buffalo. It fell into disrepair, though, and then it was rehabbed by some state prison inmates in the 1950s, and it now sits in a glass case outside New Buffalo's Railroad Museum. But the worst of the fires of 1871 was not in Chicago. It took place in northern Wisconsin and Michigan's Upper Peninsula. In fact, the Peshtigo fire is still the deadliest in U.S. history. It caused 1,200 deaths and burned 1.2 million acres. Now, the damage was much less in our area, but many people did have to flee their homes and take their possessions with them as the flames drew near. Carrie Ober of Three Oaks wrote her cousin about townspeople fighting fires all the week, adding, I packed up our clothing when it got so near to us. a lot of folks headed to the lakeshore for refuge from approaching flames. Now, Brianna's painting also shows in the distance there a fire break being plowed in the background, that dark brown stripe on the hillside. From another newspaper retrospective on the 1871 fires, Mrs. Ruff remembers that the men came from far and near with their plows and other tools to stop the flames, which came within a half-mile of the Barnhart farm. She stood on the porch of her home and listened to the sound of the great trees crashing in the flames. Now, I did find one small note of humor from this very tense time. A Three Oaks resident named Emma Thayer recalled later, one Sunday during the time of the Great Chicago Fire, the people were in church when the alarm was given that the town was in danger. All the men jumped up and ran out of the church to fight the fire. Bun Giat split his best coat down the back, much to his sorrow. I have not come across any reports of fatalities locally from the wildfires of 1871, but they did spark a lot of concern in Three Oaks. And within a year, Fred Warren, the editor of the village's first newspaper, the Reveille, was editorializing that, that a little matter will kindle a great fire. We are ill prepared in our little town to hear the cry of fire. We have no organization, no engine, no ladders, no hooks, no pails, and scarcely enough water to thoroughly wet down one building. Warren urged citizens to get together to put together a firefighting force. So 3 years after that, the Tempest Company was born. Well, the village council was still searching for a building to house their equipment 3 years later. And about a dozen years after that, they faced one of their first biggest tests, but they were unable to prevent the destruction of a rambling frame house right next to the railroad tracks in downtown Three Oaks. But the good news, from the ashes of that fire rose the village's opera house, built by William Bremer in 1891. That's the opera house in the background of this 1911 photo. A couple of quick notes about our fire exhibit. It not only covers the fires of 1871, but some more recent major blazes, like the fire in May of 1962 that destroyed 4 businesses in New Buffalo, right on the corner of Whitaker and US 12, where the variety store just closed down. The New Buffalo water system failed in that firefighting effort, and firemen had to set up a chain of fire trucks down to the Galeen River, and they had to pump river water up, truck by truck, up the hill to put out that fire. One of the businesses destroyed was Scotty's Restaurant, and the son of the owner of that business told me some amazing things about that fire that were not reported at the time or ever, as far as I can tell. Now, Ezra Scott, who's now a county commissioner in Berrien County, says New Buffalo's fire chief showed up inebriated that night. He was sent home and he returned very angry, and he took an axe to some of the fire hoses and was arrested. Scott also says that although the fire marshal ruled out arson at the time, years later someone did confess to setting that fire. It was the son of Hoder's Meat Market, which was destroyed that night. And Scott says that the son was arrested for another arson, and while he was in prison, he told officials that he'd set this New Buffalo fire as well for the insurance money. Now, Scott was a lieutenant at the prison in Michigan City at the time. I have not confirmed that story independently, but this is what he told me. And one last fire I'll mention that's part of the exhibit was the 1971 blaze that destroyed 3 businesses in downtown Galeen. The chief said it was the worst fire in Galeen's history, but just 3 months later, sadly, there was another big fire. The town's major supermarket, the IGA store, burned down there. So I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Again, I hope you'll come and see the fire display and the rest of what we have at the museum come May 1st. So I don't know if anybody has any questions.
Nick, I have a question.
Sure.
Do we know where the Barnhart property was? We
No,
know where
no.
that was.
I do not. No, that was, again, a quote from somebody recalling their experience, but it wasn't specified exactly where that was. Again,
Yeah, where it was.
Dr. Greenemeyer kind of says basically from New Buffalo all the way to Avery, that swath was burning. And then I've also read about a fire that went from Sawyer pretty much all the way to New Troy east. The winds were very strong, as you might imagine, out of the west, and they're pushing the fires to the east. And so many different areas in the upper Midwest were just dry as tinder and burned in that year, including this one. So I'm sorry, I guess I'm still doing the screen share.
Nick, do you have the names of those original Tempest Fire Company members? Are there any records?
Not that I have to say that the microfilms at the library of the newspaper that was in effect, it was the Three Oaks Echo that was 1872. There was sort of a gap between the Reveille where Fred Warren was advocating for better firefighting. There was a gap between that and the next newspaper that made a go of it. So I think the Three Oaks Echo was the newspaper at the time. And I have to tell you, there wasn't a whole lot of local news in the Three Oaks Echo.
Okay.
So there's not a lot of detail in that. My guess is that record exists somewhere. I just haven't had time to dig it up. But the Herman Gello or Gello.
I think it's pronounced Gilo. That's how I remember it from my childhood.
Okay. Yeah, I think you did tell me that, and I just neglected to note it. But he's the only one mentioned, along with, again, Charles Close was the chief.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things we have at the museum I just love is a big trumpet. Looks like a trumpet, but it is in fact the megaphone that the chief would use to stand outside the building and shout, trying to amplify his voice so the firefighters in the building could hear. So it makes you appreciate the improvements in technology there as well, right? Now they can be right in an earpiece in the fireman's ear, direct them out of danger or toward the problems. So again, we have a lot of new things coming in May, and we do have a members preview the night before. So we invite you to that on Friday, April 30th. And we're open noon to 5, Friday through Sunday, from May 1st right through the end of October. So I think with that, unless there are further questions or further comments, thank you all for coming. I appreciate your spending your Wednesday night with us.
Well, thank everybody. These were all very interesting talks.
Thank you. I should have said that at first. Thank you to the 4 people who helped present tonight. It was a lot of work, but I think
thank you too, Nick, for all your hard work.
Yes.
I think people did.
Yes, thank you, everyone. It was great.
All right. All the best. Good night.